Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about the ways that the practice of art therapy views making as expression and what this offers HCI researchers working with people with complex communication needs. The ability of participants to verbally express ideas, thoughts, needs, and preferences is often a taken for granted part of research, in interviews and surveys, but also in co-design and participatory design. But many individuals that HCI researchers are increasingly interested in working with have complex communication needs that can make communication difficult or undesirable, whether they've had traumatic or sensitive experiences, speech and language impairments, cognitive, intellectual, or developmental disabilities. One approach to this has been mitigating the effect of difficulties with communication. For example, avoiding open-ended prompts. But here we argue for an enriched understanding of making that can help us in co-design where we may want to open up participant potentials, support a wide range of topics, and envision the future. To understand how to support people with complex communication needs in generative, co-creative design engagements, we turn to the practice of art therapy. Art therapy began in the 1940s as a type of psychotherapy that brings in visual art as a treatment modality. Because it includes this alternative modality of expression, it can be particularly beneficial for people with complex communication needs. Like other forms of therapy, therapeutic goals are diverse. It might involve confronting trauma, making difficult decisions like changing jobs, having a platform for social expression, and building skills such as self-esteem, frustration tolerance, and social skills. So what does an art therapy session actually look like? The art therapist will set up the materials in the workspace ahead of time, guide a participant through an open-ended or directed art activity, and then have time for wrap-up and reflection. In the past, we've looked at art therapy from a number of perspectives. How the therapist acts as the third hand in a supportive role that centers abilities and intentions of people with cognitive impairment, how sharing takes place in art therapy, and the ways that this inspires new ways of designing sharing systems in dementia, and how art therapy is a case of a different way of thinking about dementia that we call critical dementia that is aligned with recent shifts in HCI. Here, we take a much broader view of this body of work and extend our analysis to look at how the practice of art therapy can inform co-design engagements with individuals with complex communication needs. We conducted interviews with 22 art therapists working with a variety of population, including individuals experiencing addiction, domestic violence, aphasia, and cancer. We also conducted 2 years of observation in a residential living community that includes both independent living communities as well as skilled nursing and has an art therapist on staff. And a practicing art therapist was a member of our research team. The data we collected included detailed field notes, audio recordings of group therapy sessions, photographs of the art-making process and the product, and transcribed interviews. And all this went into our grounded theory approach to analysis. The first lesson we learned from art therapists in understanding the language of materials in interactions, something of great interest in HCI. Therapists view their role as to find the right medium for the individual so that they can just express themselves. And they recognize that the choice, presentation, and expectations around the use of materials shape the possibilities for interaction. And they demonstrate a great amount of intentionality in setting up a workspace for a particular person at a particular time. Art therapists consider art materials the language, the verbs, and the nouns of visual art. One art therapist told us about a client who brought in broken pieces of a windshield to work with as an art material. And she contrasted this to a soft tulle fabric, saying that these materials say something automatically different to the viewer, just in terms of brokenness and sharpness and potential harm, in contrast to the softness and flexibility of the tulle. There's a framework that some art therapists use to think about how materials exist on a spectrum from fluid to resistive. So fluid materials like watercolors support certain affective and sensory states, while resistive materials like pens support structure and boundaries. And you can feel very differently and express very different things using different materials, as you can see in these 3 pictures by the same artist. The one on the right was drawn with a fine-tipped pen entitled Her Inner Critic. The therapist described how the woman who had drawn these pictures would not feel satisfied using acrylic and only being able to express big swirls of emotion. And she contrasted this with another person she worked with who didn't enjoy using these more resistive materials because, as she said, this participant can't create that sort of realism with her disease process. And therapists also guide clients using their knowledge of materials. Therapists spoke of avoiding fluid materials, for example, for people with anxiety or ADHD, as they can escalate a certain state. Art therapists also recognize the way that materials are situated in a socio-cultural context. They think about the idea of high art, with some therapists choosing really high-quality art materials to signal to participants that their time is worthwhile and to position them as artists. At the same time, another perspective recognizes that this positions people who don't have access or familiarity with these materials as unrefined. Some therapists spoke about how even coming into a room and telling a participant they're going to do art together could be quite intimidating. And they told us that they would bring everyday materials that they knew people had had experience with, and how working with wood or crumpling up a piece of aluminum foil might feel much more accessible to some. The second lesson we learn from art therapy is the way that the therapist creates a space for expression that emerges through the process of making. They shift the terms of communication away from verbalization to the process and product of creation, so both the process of creating art and also the artwork that is created. Therapists spoke about how solely relying on verbal language can sometimes create a barrier, and using art materials can find a different way in. They said it could be hard for people to communicate verbally for a number of different reasons. The topic can be difficult to talk about. Maybe there's trauma around it. Or maybe they've never told this to anyone before. And having the artwork there can take a lot of pressure off. It's something that people can look at together that's external. As one therapist said, it can be a lot easier to talk about a piece of artwork than to talk about yourself. Therapists aim to create a space where participants feel comfortable engaging in the process of creation, exploration, and expression of thoughts and feelings. And one way they help create an accepting, comfortable, and safe environment is by making art alongside participants, mentioning how people don't like to be watched, especially when they're talking about things that are difficult. The third lesson we learn from art therapists is the way that therapists maintain an awareness of and negotiate power dynamics to sustain participants' expressions in a broader societal context. They recognize that the people they work with are often marginalized in a number of ways, and often because of the complex communication needs that they have. They recognize that there are multiple underlying power dynamics, from the privileged position of verbal discourse to the hierarchies inherent in both art and therapy as disciplines. And they work to loosen hierarchy within sessions. Some see it as a social justice issue, not to tell people what they should be working on within a session. Some art therapists don't even refer to what they do as art therapy, saying that even using the term therapy positions people as in need of help, and people don't necessarily like to think of themselves that way. Art therapists also talk about how, though therapy takes place behind closed doors, they can work on sharing multimodal and nonverbal expressions more broadly to advocate for social change. Therapists suggest therapist supported participants in sharing artworks and exhibits, zines, self-published books, and YouTube videos. And often the purpose of sharing in these wider audiences was to challenge others' perspectives. They described how sharing artwork of people with complex communication needs can be very impactful. They talked about how having something so concrete and so visible, powerful and expressive, it's a different way than verbally saying, "I am here." And many therapists saw themselves as social advocates. As part of this, they include regular self-reflection in their practice. For example, questioning when people have cognitive impairment and might not be aware that their art is being shared. Whose agenda is it really serving to share this work? I've discussed how art therapists view making as expression for people with complex communication needs. These views have much to offer our own research and design practices. For one, in HCI, we're recognizing the importance of materials in unlocking participants' creative potentials. Art therapy brings us a rich, nuanced view of what materials say. We can rethink the different materials we use for different stages of a project. We often use Post-it notes and markers for brainstorming, but these actually might be limiting in the ways that they require succinctly written thoughts or reinforce boundaries between ideas. How might more fluid materials, such as watercolors or clay, change the way that people can be creative? We can better attend to the language of materials by understanding that material selections and arrangements also reflect a wider value system. Crayons on printer paper can evoke childlike comfort for some, but feel infantilizing to others and convey the idea that their ideas aren't being taken seriously. High-quality brushes and paints can signal to some that their work and time is valuable, but alienate others who perceive fine art as for the elite. We can also learn from being willing to be in a state of not knowing, even when this is unsettling. We can practice witnessing rather than directing, and creating alongside participants rather than observing them as some ways of shifting the dynamics of collaborative design sessions. And finally, therapists thoughtfully create spaces for participants to express sensitive thoughts and emotions that they may have never expressed before. And there's a depth and nuance to working with individuals with complex communication needs that research can often gloss over. Power relations with participants and their positions in society are rarely at the forefront of our research, but they are present in our design engagements from the moment we enter a room. We can work to understand some of the risks that arise and adjust our practices accordingly. Disclosing something too soon can be harmful. Participants may at first feel worse when they begin communicating their thoughts and feelings. And we can also think about how therapists are trained to, as one said, how to wrap somebody up in a way that they are not walking around out in the world after a therapy session completely wide open. In our sessions where we work so hard to open people up, how can we ensure that they're wrapped back up after? And finally, we can learn from the ways of our therapists who integrate an awareness of power relations into their practices and work to reduce power differentials, for example, by cultivating spaces without a right way to engage. Thank you.
So I'd like to open the floor up to questions now. So I'll start with one while we wait. Oh, okay.
Hi, Andrew from IUPUI. I'm just wondering how you're planning to take the lessons you've learned here when you go into other similar methods like a participatory design or even interviewing. Are there things that you've learned from this that you're not taking into other methods, or how can we, if we're not necessarily doing art therapy, how can we learn from you in this?
Thank you, yes. So I think some places to start, and some things I've been hearing from people, are being really intentional in the materials we select when we have participatory design and co-design sessions. So thinking really carefully about what we're signaling to people and listening really carefully to how they respond when we bring a material in a room. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Janne from Philips Design, and I was wondering, you take this of making, and can you tell us a bit more about the difference between the individual sessions and how it might turn or work out in group sessions, which often are part of design co-creation?
Yes, definitely, yeah. So I think group sessions have a lot more opportunity for participants to speak to each other and work off of each other's work, and that's what we saw in these sessions, where they might kind of arrive at a common theme together and start working off of each other's work.
And in the use of the materials or the other two elements you define, can you give recommendations for these?
So I think it's hard because sometimes you want to balance having kind of a cohesive session with people's individual needs, right? So you might have someone who's really good with watercolors, another person who's good with acrylic, but maybe you want them to guide them towards a similar goal. So one thing that therapists spoke about doing was having, that I thought was a really neat method, was having kind of quilting sessions. So people would work on little pieces, and they would actually have very individual, their individual styles reflected on these pieces. But then they knew that it was going to be joined with the others, and that it would actually make something bigger that was collective and could be shared as a group thought.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. If there isn't anybody else, I'd like to announce that this is our Best Paper Award, and to congratulate Amanda and her team on this. Please join me in congratulating her.